In the winter of 1942, the Pyrenees lay under deep snow, a white wall dividing occupied France from neutral Spain. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, and the mountain passes were patrolled by German soldiers who had orders to shoot on sight. In that landscape, a young Belgian woman, Andrée de Jongh, led 2 Allied airmen who had been shot down over Belgium. Their route southward, stretching from Brussels to the Spanish border, was not part of any official plan. It existed only in her memory and in the courage of those willing to help her along the way. The crossing would take 3 nights. They could move only after dusk, hiding during the day in barns and empty shepherds' huts. If caught, the pilots faced execution. Andree would be interrogated and sent to a concentration camp. Yet she pressed on, guiding them by the shape of the ridges and the sound of the streams that cut through the valleys. Later historians would identify that journey as the birth of the Comet Line, one of the most successful escape networks of the Second World War. At the time of this first mission, Andrée de Jongh was 25 years old. She had been trained as a nurse and had volunteered with the Belgian Red Cross before the occupation. She possessed no military experience, no weapon, and no formal authority, only a calm manner and an ability to inspire confidence. Those qualities, combined with a sense of personal responsibility, became the foundation of the organization she would build. Survivor testimonies describe her walking ahead of the group, testing the ground for ice and listening for patrols. She carried no lamp, because even a glimmer of light could expose them. Her knowledge of the route came entirely from memory. No maps were drawn, and no written notes existed. Every safe house, every crossing point, every password was learned by heart, and passed verbally from one helper to another. By 1942, the German occupation authorities had tightened control along the French-Spanish frontier. Entire villages were punished for sheltering fugitives, and the Gestapo had agents embedded in local police units. Nevertheless, Andree managed to link together a fragile chain of civilians who were willing to take the risk. They were priests, farmers, railway workers and nuns who opened their doors to strangers and then prayed they would not be discovered. British intelligence later described it as a network held together by conscience rather than command. During that first crossing, one of the airmen slipped on a frozen slope and injured his leg. According to the British debrief report, Andree redistributed his load, slowed the pace, and refused to turn back. After 3 nights of travel, the group reached Spanish territory, exhausted, frostbitten, but alive. The pilots were transferred to the British Embassy in Madrid. De Jongh rested for a single day, and then returned across the mountains to France to guide the next group. That decision, to go back into danger rather than remain in safety, defined her role in the war. Most guides who reached Spain stayed there. Few risked returning to occupied Europe. Andree did. In her view, the route was not a personal achievement but a responsibility that could not end while others were still trapped. Within months, her individual effort evolved into an organized system. The pathway from Brussels through Paris to Bayonne and over the Pyrenees became known officially as the Comet Line. Couriers carried coded messages disguised as postal receipts. Airmen were hidden in apartments above cafes and in convent schools. Everything depended on discipline and trust. British Special Operations files confirm that the Comet Line evacuated more than 80 Allied personnel in its first year. There were no written orders, no ranks, and almost no money. Funding arrived only later through secret channels from London. Until then, Andree and her sister financed the operation themselves, buying train tickets, forged identity papers, and food for the men they escorted. Those who met her remembered a reserved young woman with a steady gaze who spoke little about danger. She slept on trains, changed addresses constantly, and maintained strict security habits, never staying twice in the same safe house, never keeping personal letters. For military historians, that first winter crossing demonstrated that effective resistance did not require weapons, only coordination and moral conviction. The success of the Comet Line persuaded British intelligence that civilian-run escape routes could complement formal operations such as those of the SOE. In later reports, the analysts described Andree's work as a prototype born out of belief rather than strategy. After the war, she rarely mentioned that night in the mountains. In a letter written in 1954, she referred to it briefly. The silence, the exhaustion, the fear of leaving tracks that snow would preserve until morning. She wrote that she kept walking because stopping would mean abandoning someone's son. For researchers studying the period, that remark captures the essence of her motivation, a personal sense of duty that existed outside ideology or politics. By the time Andrée de Jongh returned to France after her first successful mission, the Comet Line had become more than a route. It was a lifeline. Over the next 2 years, more than 800 Allied servicemen would follow the path she opened. But on that first night in 1942, there were only 3 figures moving through the snow. 2 airmen who hoped to survive, and 1 young nurse who refused to let them die. Andrée Eugénie Andrée de Jongh was born on November 30th, 1916, in Schaerbeek, a working-class district of Brussels. Her father, Frédéric de Jongh, was a school headmaster known for his discipline and quiet sense of duty. Her mother, Alice, worked as a nurse and taught her daughter the basics of first aid and compassion. The family belonged to the Catholic middle class, educated, patriotic, and modest. They believed that service to others was a moral obligation, not a gesture of heroism. Those values would later form the core of Andrée's character. She grew up in the shadow of the First World War. The stories told by her parents were not of triumph, but of occupation, hunger, and ordinary courage. Belgium had been invaded in 1914. Its civil population suffered under German rule. By the time she was a teenager, the memory of that trauma still shaped the national consciousness. Her father's school often held commemorations for the dead of the Great War. Andrée would sit in the front row, listening as the names were read aloud and the bells tolled. To her, courage was not abstract. It was a list of ordinary names, spoken each November. By the early 1930s, she had finished secondary education and expressed a desire to study art. For a short time, she attended the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, but she found herself drawn to practical work rather than studio life. She trained as a nurse and volunteered for the Red Cross. Friends from that period remember a reserved young woman with a sharp memory and a calm temperament. One of her instructors wrote that she was efficient, quiet, and entirely reliable in crisis. These were qualities that would later define the success of her resistance work. In 1939, Europe moved toward war once again. Belgium declared neutrality, as it had done in 1914, but few believed that its borders would hold. When Germany invaded Poland in September, Andrée was 22. She worked in a hospital ward for convalescent soldiers and spent evenings helping with medical supplies for refugees from the east. The atmosphere in Brussels was one of apprehension rather than panic. The country had experienced occupation before and feared its return. The German invasion of Belgium began on May 10, 1940. The advance was rapid, and by May 28, the Belgian army had surrendered. King Leopold III capitulated, and the civil government fled to France. For most citizens, the change was sudden and absolute. Within days, German officers occupied town halls, and the swastika flew over the capital. For Andrée de Jongh, it was not a moment of shock, but of decision. According to post-war interviews with family members, she remarked that, "If we wait for orders to be brave, we will wait forever." Her first acts of resistance were simple. She used her nursing contacts to send messages to Belgian soldiers who had been captured and detained in transit camps. She helped distribute food to families whose homes had been destroyed in the bombing of Louvain and Mechelen. When British airmen began to fall over Belgium in 1941, she joined small groups that hid them from the Germans. At that time, there was no centralised network. Each case was improvised. The risk was enormous. Anyone caught sheltering an Allied serviceman faced execution or deportation to a camp. It was through these early contacts that she met individuals who would later form the backbone of the Comet Line. Among them were Henri and Jeanne de Grief in Brussels, who offered their home as a safe house, and Count Jacques de Saint-Aldegonde, who provided forged papers. Each link was based on trust alone. There were no formal agreements, no hierarchies, only the shared belief that helping captured men was a moral obligation. Andrée herself later said that she saw no difference between a wounded soldier in a hospital and a wounded soldier hiding in a cellar. Both needed a nurse. Her father, Andrée de Jongh, played an important role in the development of her plans. By 1941, he was already involved in underground activities as the director of Catholic schools in Brussels. He helped Andrée establish contacts within parish networks and provided financial support for her first journeys. Their collaboration was both practical and emotional. They shared a sense of purpose rooted in education and faith, the belief that knowledge and duty could resist tyranny even without weapons. It was also a bond that would later cost him his life. Throughout 1941, Andrée observed that many airmen who had been shot down were caught while trying to cross the Franco-Belgian border alone. Those who did reach France often found themselves trapped north of the Pyrenees. She realized that the problem was not hiding the pilots, it was getting them home. Her solution was simple in concept and extraordinary in execution. Create a continuous line of safe houses from Belgium to Spain and escort the airmen personally. She called it the Comet Line because, in her words, a comet travels in darkness but always finds its way to light. Although this phrase was recorded years later and may have been paraphrased, it captures the spirit of her initiative. Her approach was methodical. She mapped the route mentally, testing each segment before using it for real operations. She spent weeks travelling between Brussels and Paris to verify safe houses and identify railway connections that avoided German inspection points. She kept no written records, carried no maps, and memorised every address. By late 1941, she had successfully escorted several small groups of pilots from Belgium to France. Each success reinforced her credibility within the Allied community and attracted new volunteers. What distinguished Andrée de Jongh from many other resistance figures was her complete lack of self-promotion. She avoided political statements and refused to join partisan movements. Her motivation was humanitarian, not ideological. She once explained to a British interviewer that to help someone in danger is not resistance, it is normal behaviour. That pragmatic view made her operations more secure. She treated them as a medical duty, not a revolt. By the end of 1941, the Comet Line was ready for its first major mission, a full transfer of 2 Allied airmen from Brussels through France to Spain. That journey, completed in early 1942, would mark the moment when her personal initiative evolved into an international operation. It was the culmination of everything her childhood and family had taught her, that courage was not a theory to admire, but a duty to perform. From that point forward, the girl who had once believed in heroes would become one herself, though she would never call it that. By the summer of 1940, Belgium was fully under German control. The occupation was efficient, systematic, and designed to suppress any potential for organised resistance. Newspapers were censored, travel was restricted, and German propaganda filled public spaces. The Luftwaffe used Belgian airfields to launch raids on Britain, and the Gestapo quickly established offices in Brussels and Liège. For many Belgians, the new regime meant survival through compliance. For Andrée de Jongh, it meant the loss of everything she considered normal. Hospitals were requisitioned, Red Cross operations placed under military supervision, and citizens ordered to register for identification cards stamped with a black eagle. The occupation turned daily life into an exercise in quiet endurance. During the early months, Andrée continued to work in a local hospital. She treated both civilians and German soldiers, maintaining the professional neutrality expected of medical staff. But the presence of the occupiers was a constant reminder that neutrality was a form of submission. In 1941, the first Allied aircraft began to fall across Belgian territory, as British bombers and fighters engaged in raids over northern Europe. Most of the downed pilots were young men, 19, 20, sometimes even younger. Those who survived the crashes were immediately hunted by German patrols. For locals, sheltering them meant risking imprisonment or death. Yet word spread that some civilians were already helping. The pattern was always the same. A pilot would parachute into a field or forest, be found by farmers or villagers, and hidden in an attic or barn. Within hours, the German Feldgendarmerie would arrive, searching house by house. The success of any escape depended on speed, getting the airman out of the area before his presence was reported. Andree recognized the need for a system that could move these men safely and discreetly across the country. She had no radio or intelligence contacts, only determination and an understanding of how ordinary people could be organized around a single purpose. In 1941, she began making contact with others who shared her sense of urgency. Through her father's connections in Catholic schools, she was introduced to sympathetic priests and teachers. In Brussels, she met Philippe and Andrée de Jongh, no relation, who had already sheltered several British pilots. Together, they discussed the possibility of creating a continuous route southwards, from the Belgian countryside to France, and eventually to Spain. The idea was not new. Small escape routes had existed since the fall of France. What Andree proposed, however, was coordination. A chain of civilians who would hand airmen from one safe house to the next, reducing exposure and increasing efficiency. The challenge was immense. Every region had its own patrol schedules, checkpoints, and informants. Railway journeys required forged documents and careful timing to avoid inspection. Communications were limited to handwritten notes or messages relayed by travellers. To solve this, Andree insisted on compartmentalization. Each participant would know only one or two others, enough to complete their part of the journey, but not enough to expose the entire network if captured. This principle, borrowed later by professional intelligence agencies, was intuitive for her. She described it as a matter of common sense. By late 1941, the first pilot moved through the route successfully. It was a test case. A young RAF sergeant guided from northern Belgium to Paris using a combination of train travel and rural footpaths. The operation relied on women couriers because women could move more freely and attract less suspicion. Andree herself accompanied the pilot to the French capital, then returned to Belgium to plan the next mission. Each success encouraged expansion. What had begun as a local effort started to connect with French underground groups and, eventually, with British representatives in neutral Spain. As her activities increased, so did the danger. The Gestapo launched systematic campaigns to dismantle resistance cells, offering rewards for information. Posters warned citizens that aiding Allied personnel was treason, punishable by death. Surveillance intensified on trains and in postal systems. Despite this, Andree continued to travel, often using false names and papers identifying her as a governess or a textile worker. Her youth and calm demeanour helped her blend in. Many who later met her said she looked more like a student than a leader of an underground movement. In early 1942, she formalised her organisation under the name Comet Line, Le Réseau Comet. The name, according to her own explanation, symbolised movement through darkness, swift and fleeting, leaving only a trace of light. By then, the network included several dozen people across Belgium and northern France. Couriers escorted airmen to Brussels, where they stayed in safe houses until a train could be arranged to Paris. From there, French contacts guided them further south to Bayonne, and then across the Pyrenees to Spain. It was a complex system run entirely by civilians, without weapons or radio support, and dependent on trust and improvisation. The turning point came when British intelligence, through the embassy in Madrid, learned of her success. Reports from rescued pilots confirmed that the same young Belgian woman had led multiple groups through occupied territory. In response, MI9, the British agency responsible for assisting escape and evasion, began discreetly financing the Comet Line. Funds and forged documents were delivered through diplomatic channels in Spain. For the first time, Andree's work was recognised at an international level, though she herself continued to operate as if nothing had changed. Her priority remained the same: move the next group. The risks were relentless. In August 1942, her father, Frédéric, who had been helping coordinate the Belgian side of the line, was arrested by the Gestapo in Paris. He was interrogated and later executed at the concentration camp in Gross-Rosen. Andree never saw him again. Those who knew her said she did not speak about his death during the war. She simply continued working, convinced that stopping would make his sacrifice meaningless. By late 1942, the Comet Line had evacuated more than 200 Allied servicemen. It became one of the most efficient escape networks in occupied Europe. operating alongside other lines such as Pat-O'Leary in Marseille and Shelburne in Brittany. Yet it remained distinct in its simplicity and in its leadership. A woman, unarmed, without military training, directing a multinational resistance effort under constant surveillance. For the German authorities, the Comet Line became a significant target. Counterintelligence units began tracing patterns in railway tickets, intercepted letters, and rumours. Several of Andree's couriers were captured, some were executed, others sent to Ravensbrück. Each arrest forced her to rebuild the chain, recruiting new helpers and changing routes. The resilience of the network was remarkable, a reflection of her methodical planning and her insistence on discipline. When historians later analysed resistance in occupied Europe, they noted that the Comet Line represented a new form of warfare, civilian, decentralised, and moral rather than ideological. It did not seek to kill the enemy, but to save lives under his control. In that sense, it challenged the traditional definitions of combat. Andrée de Jongh, with her nurse's background and practical intelligence, embodied that shift. She treated the war as an emergency ward, chaotic, dangerous, but governed by procedure and duty. By the end of 1942, the Allies knew her only by codename, Dédé. To those she guided, she was the face of safety. To the Gestapo, she was one of the most wanted figures in Western Europe. And yet throughout it all, she remained outwardly anonymous. A woman moving through train stations and mountain paths, quiet, composed, and determined. The sky had fallen across Europe, but she had found a way to walk beneath it, carrying others toward the light. By early 1943, the Comet Line had reached its operational peak. Its routes extended from the industrial towns of Belgium through northern France to the Spanish frontier. Each stage of the journey was managed by civilians who had no military background and often no direct contact with one another. The system depended entirely on trust, precision, and silence. At its centre stood Andrée de Jongh, still only 26 years old, still unarmed, still committed to the simple principle that had guided her from the beginning. No one left behind. The logistics of moving airmen through occupied territory required constant adaptation. Every journey began in Brussels, where downed Allied pilots were hidden in ordinary apartments or behind shop fronts. They were provided with civilian clothes and false identity papers, usually describing them as deaf-mute labourers to explain their lack of French. From Brussels they were escorted by train to Paris, often changing carriages mid-route to avoid German inspections. Paris served as a transfer hub. Here, local volunteers arranged new papers, lodging and railway connections south. Each airman carried a false name, a story, and sometimes a photograph of a fictional family. Any slip in consistency could mean death. Andrée de Jongh personally accompanied many of these journeys. She travelled lightly, without luggage, blending into the crowds at stations such as Gare du Nord and Austerlitz. Her composure became her greatest protection. German officers rarely suspected that a quiet young woman with a satchel could be responsible for the disappearance of dozens of Allied servicemen. Witnesses later recalled her calm confidence, even when soldiers boarded trains to conduct searches. She would open her handbag, smile, and show forged work permits as if she were irritated by the delay. The disguise worked because it relied not on acting but on authenticity. She truly appeared to have nothing to hide. South of Paris, the line entered its most dangerous stage. German patrols and Vichy police monitored every train and road to the Pyrenees. Civilians were required to carry travel passes, and border crossings were closed except for authorised workers. To avoid detection, the Comet Line used a system of overlapping couriers. A French contact would meet the group at a predetermined café or church and escort them by bicycle or on foot to the next village. At night they were sheltered in farmhouses or convents. Every participant risked arrest and torture. The physical crossing of the Pyrenees remained the hardest part. Weather conditions could change within hours. Snow and fog reduced visibility to meters. The average climb took 2 days and nights, with little food or rest. Andrée trained herself for these conditions, building endurance through repeated crossings. Pilots who later described the experience spoke of her determination. She set the pace, carried supplies, and refused to turn back even when German patrols were known to be nearby. In one report, an RAF sergeant recalled that she stopped only once to check the stars and confirm direction. She never used a map. The cooperation with British intelligence intensified during this period. Through MI9, funds and instructions reached Spain, where the British Embassy in Madrid coordinated the reception of escapees. Once airmen crossed the border, they were questioned, fed, and transported to Gibraltar for repatriation to Britain. Their debriefings provided valuable intelligence on German radar and flight patterns. Each returning pilot represented not only a saved life, but also critical military information. MI9 referred to the Comet Line as a model of efficiency and discretion. Inside occupied territory, however, the dangers multiplied. The Gestapo began identifying patterns in rail travel and investigating missing persons reports. Informants were paid to monitor suspicious activity near train stations. The Germans suspected the existence of an organised escape network, but underestimated its scale and leadership. They assumed it was run by British agents. The idea that a Belgian nurse could be directing operations across 3 countries seemed implausible. This underestimation, for a time, protected her. By mid-1943, the Comet Line had suffered severe losses. Several of its French and Belgian couriers were captured, some were executed, others were deported to concentration camps. Each arrest forced Andree to rebuild sections of the network from scratch. She moved constantly, sleeping in safe houses for no more than 2 nights. Her ability to memorize names, addresses, and schedules became vital. She wrote nothing down. Survivors later said that her discipline bordered on the mechanical. She never drank, never kept souvenirs, and never allowed sentimentality to influence operational decisions. The network continued to function despite these pressures. Between 1941 and 1944, more than 800 Allied airmen and soldiers escaped through the Comet Line. The majority were British, but there were also Americans, Canadians, Australians, and Poles. Many of them later testified that they owed their lives to Andrée de Jongh and her volunteers. The airmen were often unaware of the full danger their guides faced. If captured, resistance members were not protected by the Geneva Convention and were treated as spies. The conditions in the Pyrenees crossings were particularly brutal during winter. De Jongh prepared groups by instructing them on silence, movement, and basic survival. She carried morphine ampules and bandages from her medical training. Despite her precautions, not every attempt succeeded. Some groups were intercepted by German patrols, others were lost in snowstorms. Every failure weighed heavily on her, yet she never considered stopping. In one post-war interview she said simply, "Stopping would not bring them back, and continuing might save the next one." The scope of her work eventually drew the attention of the Abwehr and Gestapo. They placed informants in railway stations and cafes across southern France. A single betrayal could unravel the entire operation. In June 1943, an informant in Paris reported unusual movements of foreign-looking men accompanied by a woman answering Andrée's description. She was arrested later that year, but at this stage of her story, before the arrest, her focus remained entirely on maintaining the line. Every morning she woke with a new task: find shelter, arrange papers, move people. It was a rhythm of constant motion, a life measured in train schedules and whispered instructions. Her father's execution deepened her resolve. Those close to her later said that she rarely spoke of him, but his loss strengthened her conviction that moral duty required persistence regardless of cost. The Comet Line had become not only a rescue network, but a memorial in motion, a living response to oppression. Through her, hundreds reached safety. Through her, the idea of resistance acquired a new meaning. Not sabotage or violence, but protection, compassion, and organisation. By the end of 1943, the network was nearing collapse from exhaustion and infiltration. Andrée herself had become the target of a continent-wide manhunt. Posters described her as dangerous, though she had never carried a weapon. She knew that capture was only a matter of time, yet she continued to lead groups through the Pyrenees personally, believing that her presence reassured the airmen and discouraged hesitation. Each journey could be her last, but as long as one more pilot reached Spain, the risk was justified. In later years, Historians would note that the strength of the Comet Line lay not in its size but in its discipline. It was built on the principle that small, consistent acts could accumulate into a movement powerful enough to challenge an empire. Under Andrée de Jongh's leadership, that principle held for more than 2 years. The road through darkness had become a path of light, fragile, narrow and perilous, but real. And though it would soon close under the weight of betrayal and war, its legacy would outlast the conflict itself, carried in the memories of those who walked it and survived. In January 1944, the Comet Line was nearing its breaking point. After 2 years of relentless activity, it had been weakened by arrests, informants, and exhaustion. German intelligence had begun to understand its structure, mapping the movement of Allied airmen from Brussels to Bayonne. The Gestapo concentrated its efforts on Paris, where couriers often changed trains and documents. In that dangerous atmosphere, Andrée de Jongh continued to travel, unaware that betrayal was already closing in. The collapse began with a single informant. In December 1943, a French collaborator reported suspicious activity at a café in Paris, used by Comet couriers. The Gestapo organised a trap, posing as downed Allied pilots in need of help. When a contact agreed to assist, they followed him to the safe house and arrested everyone inside. Documents seized during the raid included addresses and false identity papers. Among them was information pointing to Andrée de Jongh. She was captured on January 15, 1944, near the Gare du Nord station. Accounts of her arrest differ slightly. Some say she was recognised from a description, others that she was betrayed by an infiltrator who had joined the line weeks earlier. What is certain is that she did not attempt to escape. She carried forged papers identifying her as a textile worker from Liège. When confronted, she presented them calmly and denied involvement in any illegal activity. The Gestapo, already aware of her real identity, took her into custody and transported her to their headquarters at Avenue Foch. Interrogation began immediately. The Germans demanded the names of other members of the Comet Line, the locations of safe houses, and the identities of Allied personnel who had reached Spain. De Jongh refused to cooperate. Survivors from the same prison later recalled that she endured repeated questioning and physical abuse. The Gestapo alternated threats with promises, offering her release in exchange for information. She provided none. One officer reportedly told her that resistance work was pointless because the war was already lost for the Allies. She answered simply that if that were true, they would not be interrogating her. After several weeks of imprisonment, she was transferred to Fresnes prison, south of Paris, where hundreds of resistance members were held. Conditions were harsh: overcrowded cells, limited food, and daily roll calls. Prisoners were isolated to prevent communication. Despite this, Andrée managed to exchange brief words with other detainees. They later described her as composed and quietly encouraging. She gave practical advice: how to endure hunger, how to keep track of time, how to maintain focus when cut off from the outside world. It was the same discipline she had demanded of others in the field, now applied to survival behind bars. In March 1944, she was deported to Germany, first to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, then to the Mauthausen subcamp at Altenburg. Transport. Records list her by number, without occupation or title. She was one of thousands of women classified as political prisoners. Ravensbrück was notorious for its brutality. Forced labour, disease, and executions were routine. Yet, according to testimonies of survivors, she continued to assist others as best she could, tending to the sick and sharing food rations. Her background as a nurse once again became her means of resistance. The mortality rate in Ravensbrück was extremely high. Inmates endured 12-hour workdays, inadequate clothing, and freezing temperatures. Beatings and public punishments were common. Those deemed unfit for labour were sent to gas chambers. Andrée avoided this fate partly by maintaining discipline and health, but also by luck. In later interviews, fellow prisoners said she rarely spoke about her past or her work, fearing it would endanger others still free. When guards asked what she had done before the war, she reportedly answered, "I was a nurse." It was true, but it concealed everything. Her endurance reflected not only physical strength but also moral clarity. She did not see herself as a victim, even in captivity. In a post-war conversation with British officers, She explained that she regarded imprisonment as a continuation of the same task, to hold firm so that others might live. That phrase became emblematic of her philosophy. She viewed resistance not as defiance, but as responsibility. As Allied forces advanced into Western Europe in the summer of 1944, many prisoners were moved deeper into Germany to prevent liberation. De Jongh was transferred once again, this time to the camp at Königsberg in Bavaria. Conditions there were marginally better, though still harsh. Food shortages increased, and typhus spread through the barracks. By then, she was severely underweight and suffering from exhaustion, yet she survived until April 1945, when the camp was liberated by American troops. Her recovery was slow. She weighed barely 40 kilograms and suffered from malnutrition and chronic infection. Medical reports from the time note that she refused special treatment, insisting that others were worse off. When asked by Allied debriefers about her experiences, she minimized them, focusing instead on the operation of the Comet Line and the fate of those still missing. She provided names of captured couriers and requested information about their families. To the astonishment of British officers, she expressed no hatred toward her captors. She described them as men who lost their humanity by obedience. The war ended weeks later, but for Andree, the transition to peace was not simple. Returning to Belgium, she found her country physically liberated, but emotionally divided. Collaboration trials, shortages, and grief marked daily life. Many of her former comrades were dead, others were still in camps. The Comet Line had ceased to exist, but its record of more than 800 successful escapes was now public. For the first time, her name appeared in official reports. She received British, American, and Belgian honours, including the George Medal, the Medal of Freedom, and the Croix de Guerre. Yet she accepted them reluctantly. When journalists asked her to describe her achievements, she replied, "I only did what had to be done." In the decades that followed, her wartime silence continued. She avoided interviews and public ceremonies. Those who knew her after 1945 described a woman unchanged, reserved, courteous, and uninterested in recognition. When she finally agreed to speak for an oral history project in the 1970s, her recollections were brief and precise. She confirmed key facts about operations, corrected misconceptions, and dismissed any attempt to romanticize the work. It was not adventure, she said. It was logistics. Historians later noted that her experience in captivity illustrated the limits of human endurance and the strength of moral conviction. She had faced one of the most powerful security systems of the 20th century and refused to yield. Her resistance, both active and silent, revealed that courage was not limited to combat, but could be expressed through consistency, restraint, and dignity. Andrée de Jongh's capture and survival mark the end of the Comet Line as an operational network, but not the end of its impact. Many of those she rescued went on to fight again and to testify on her behalf after the war. Their accounts confirmed that she had never asked for gratitude or payment. To them, she remained Day, the calm figure who appeared out of nowhere, guided them through darkness, and disappeared again into the crowd. Her courage met pain, and neither broke the other. Liberation did not bring simplicity. When Andrée de Jongh returned to Belgium in mid-1945, she found a country scarred by occupation and moral exhaustion. The celebration of victory was shadowed by trials for collaboration and the grief of tens of thousands who had not come home. Brussels, once filled with German banners, was now filled with questions. For those who had resisted, there was pride, but also disquiet. Many survivors felt displaced in peacetime. De Jongh was one of them. She had lived for years according to rules of secrecy and urgency. Suddenly there was time, but no clear purpose. The Belgian government recognized her contribution almost immediately. In August 1945, she received the Croix de Guerre with palms and the Medal of the Resistance. Foreign governments followed. The British awarded her the George Medal, the Americans the Medal of Freedom, and France the Légion d'honneur. Photographs from those ceremonies show her standing in uniform beside decorated officers, smaller than the men around her, expression calm and distant. She accepted the medals out of duty, not celebration. When asked by a reporter what the awards meant to her, she replied, "They belong to the others, the ones who did not return." For several months she assisted Allied authorities in tracing missing members of the Comet Line. She compiled lists from memory, wrote to families of those who had disappeared, and testified at the trials of collaborators. Her statements were concise, factual, and without anger. She provided evidence that saved some from false accusation and confirmed guilt in other cases. After that, she withdrew from public life. She avoided political debates and declined offers to join veterans' associations. In a letter to a friend, she wrote that peace required silence. Too many people are still speaking for the dead. In 1946, she left Belgium to work with the Belgian Red Cross in British-occupied Germany. There, she supervised medical relief for displaced persons and survivors of concentration camps. The task was grim but familiar: order, rationing, recovery. Former colleagues noted her discipline and empathy. She treated German civilians with the same professionalism she had shown Allied prisoners. "Suffering has no nationality," she told a nurse who questioned her impartiality. It was a statement that reflected her enduring belief in responsibility over revenge. After 2 years, she returned briefly to Brussels, then volunteered for service in the Belgian Congo. She spent nearly a decade in remote hospitals, treating tropical diseases and training local nurses. Few in Belgium knew where she was. She rarely wrote letters and never sought publicity. When journalists eventually traced her to Leopoldville in the mid-1950s, she refused interviews. "There are better stories here," she said, gesturing toward her patients. The war for her was no longer a subject to discuss. It was a memory to carry quietly. Her later life followed the same pattern of service and restraint. In the 1960s, she joined a medical mission in Ethiopia and later in Algeria during the War of Independence. She lived simply, often in conditions harsher than those she had faced in Europe. Those who worked with her described her as precise, self-contained, and uncomplaining. She maintained the habits of the resistance: no unnecessary talk, no display of emotion, and absolute reliability. The few personal photographs that survive show a woman in her 50s with clear eyes and a faint, reserved smile, the expression of someone who had long ago decided that purpose mattered more than comfort. Recognition returned in the 1970s when historians and filmmakers began documenting the civilian resistance movements of Western Europe. The Comet Line was rediscovered as one of the most successful escape networks of the war. De Jongh was invited to ceremonies in London, Paris, and Brussels. She attended reluctantly, speaking only to correct inaccuracies. At one event, she stood before a group of former RAF airmen who had been rescued by her network. When they applauded, she bowed slightly and said, "You were the reason we walked." It was the closest she ever came to public emotion. Her health began to decline in the 1980s, and she retired to a convent-run home near Brussels. Even there, she continued small acts of routine service, helping with correspondence, comforting new residents, insisting on making her own bed. Visitors who came expecting a heroine found a quiet, practical woman who preferred to talk about nursing rather than resistance. When asked how she had endured Ravensbrück, she answered, "By doing the work that was in front of me." That simplicity defined her to the end. Andrée de Jongh died on October 13, 2007, at the age of 90. Her funeral in Brussels was attended by Belgian veterans, representatives of Allied air forces, and former members of the Comet Line. The ceremony was modest, as she had requested. No military parade, no speeches beyond a brief eulogy from an RAF officer who had once been among those she led across the mountains. He described her as the smallest and bravest person I ever followed. The Belgian Air Force provided a single flypast, its sound fading into the autumn sky. Today, the memorials to the Comet Line stand in Belgium, France, and Spain. Trails in the Pyrenees mark the routes once walked at night by frightened airmen and the young woman who guided them. Museums display her photograph and the forged papers she carried. To most visitors, she is a symbol of quiet defiance. Yet historians who study her life emphasize something deeper. She represented a form of resistance grounded not in hatred or ideology, but in organization, competence, and moral clarity. She proved that heroism could exist without violence, that saving lives under occupation was itself an act of war. More than 800 Allied servicemen escaped through the network she built. Dozens of her colleagues died in prisons and camps. The Comet Line lasted less than 3 years, yet its impact stretched far beyond its numbers. It demonstrated that individuals, acting from conscience, could oppose a system designed to crush all independence. When Andrée de Jongh spoke of her work, she never used the word hero. She called it a duty, the natural response of one human being to the suffering of another. The world remembered her eventually, but she never asked to be remembered. Her story endures because it defines the quiet center of courage, discipline, persistence, and mercy under pressure. Long after the war ended, those who survived because of her still repeated the same simple truth, that one woman, walking through snow in the dead of night, proved that light could exist even when the world had gone dark. That completes the 6-chapter BBC-style documentary narrative of Andrée de Jongh, The Little Cyclone. Would you like me to now assemble a short summary paragraph for the video's opening voiceover, 30 to 40 seconds, matching the tone and setting up the full story?